Welcome to today's Explainer. We're digging into a seriously complex, honestly kind of unsettling story today. We're going to unpack the true narrative behind Hannahmurray's book, The Make-Believe, a memoir of magic and madness. Now, reading this, it feels exactly like a gripping psychological thriller. But here's the kicker. It's 100% real. It's a true account of deep vulnerability and intense manipulation. So, let's explore how someone's entire reality can just completely unravel.
Okay, let's dive right into this. The memoir actually kicks off with this incredibly haunting quote from sci-fi legend Philip K. Dick. And it just perfectly sets the stage for everything we're about to talk about. Most of us take our grip on reality completely for granted, right? We just assume the ground beneath our feet is solid. But what happens when the exact same practices you use to succeed in your career start totally dismantling your understanding of what's real and what's just make-believe?
Before we get into the nitty-gritty of that psychological breakdown, let's take a second to establish exactly who we're talking about here. You've almost certainly seen Hannahmurray on your screen over the last decade or so. She's skyrocketed to fame as Cassie in the iconic teen drama Skins, and then, of course, reached massive global recognition playing Gilly in HBO's Game of Thrones. But what this explainer is going to unpack is the absolutely terrifying off-screen journey she went on. It builds to a climax that is honestly just so hard to imagine for someone with such visible mainstream success.
Section 1. The Breakdown of Reality.
To really wrap our heads around the severity of this, we're going to plunge straight into the climax of her story. We kind of need to see where this nightmare ends up before we can understand how on earth she got there. The book drops us right into this terrifying, totally surreal environment. Hannah realizes she's in a psychiatric ward, an asylum. But the wild part is, her perception of this place is completely warped. She doesn't think she's a patient. No, she's convinced she's there on a mission to heal everyone in the facility. The imagery she describes is just deeply disturbing. At one point, she hallucinates walking down a hallway and seeing a woman with her lips literally sewn shut. Yet in her mind, she believes a healing light coming out of her own body is going to cure this horrific suffering.
And the hallucinations only get more intense from there. She envisions her mother walking right beside her, acting as this anchor carrying the, quote, library of her life. Driven by this intense need for a kind of baptism, she actually strips off all her clothes to be as naked as the day she was born in the ward's bathtub. Because in her reality, she isn't a sick patient wandering a mental health facility. She is a glowing golden beacon of light. Her bare feet are slopping against the linoleum, the air around her is literally humming, and she feels completely, utterly powerful. But then, the whole thing just cuts to black.
Out of that total darkness comes the deeply sinister twist at the core of this memoir. In that blackness, she realizes her body is being controlled by a man. Her spine is bent backward, fluid as a snake. She notes so chillingly that she is his servant, his acolyte. She truly believes she is a trained weapon who would commit murder without a second thought if he just gave the word. She would die for him simply because he has entirely taken over her mind. So the massive question this leaves us grappling with is, how did a highly successful, well-educated actor end up completely surrendering to a man manipulating her in the dark?
Section 2. The Trauma of Acting.
To figure out how she handed her mind over to a manipulator, we really have to rewind the clock to the grueling catalyst of her breakdown. And that breaking point started on the set of Kathryn Bigelow's movie Detroit. Now, this film depicts the horrific 1967 Detroit uprising, zooming in on one specific night at the Algiers Motel, where police violently interrogated guests, tragically resulting in the murder of 3 young black men. Hannah played Julie, a real-life survivor of that actual night. And guys, playing a real living person who was actually visiting the set brought this immense, crushing weight of responsibility. She felt an overwhelming duty to absorb this living woman's trauma so she could tell her story authentically.
But here's the thing, this wasn't her first rodeo with dark material. It was a compounding issue that built up over years. Let's look at this timeline for a second. Over her career, she essentially conditioned herself to suffer for her art. Back in 2007, she had to simulate swallowing over 100 pills and vomiting. Jump to 2013, she's being dragged out of a blood-filled bathtub with slit wrists. In 2015, she was left covered in angry welts after hanging in a super painful harness for a shoot. And then we hit 2016 on the set of Detroit. Here, she had to film a horrific scene involving physical and sexual assault where her dress was violently ripped from her body over and over and over again.
And this brilliantly illustrates the terrifying disconnect happening inside of her. Her conscious mind was busy rationalizing all this trauma. She kept telling herself, hey, it's just a job. I'm surrounded by professionals. I just need to push through.
But her physical body? It had absolutely no idea it was on a movie set. Her heart was constantly racing. Her nervous system was literally on fire. She was plagued by terrible nightmares, and she kept waking up in the middle of the night violently vomiting. Her mind kept screaming, "Pretend," but her body was registering pure visceral trauma.
Section 3. Blurring the lines.
Okay, so her body was clearly breaking down. But what about her mind? Well, let's look at how her specific approach to acting began to permanently crack her sense of self. Earlier in her career, while prepping to play Leon Trotsky's secretary, an acting coach introduced her to this incredibly dangerous concept called shamanic acting. The whole idea was to stop making conscious acting choices. Instead, you're supposed to open yourself up as a vessel and just let history, spirits, and raw trauma, quote, come through you. She chugged double espressos just to stay awake, intentionally making herself raw and thin-skinned so all this foreign rage and devastation could just course right through her. She was literally training her own brain to blur reality and fiction, erasing her own boundaries so something else could take the wheel.
Section 4. The Search for a Fix.
With all her boundaries completely erased, she was desperate for an anchor. But the heavy toll of acting wasn't working in a vacuum. It was actually cracking open some really deep, pre-existing wounds. Hannah gets super vulnerable in the book, detailing severe bouts of depression that went all the way back to her teenage years. On top of that, she carried this intense survivor's guilt over her mother's 5 miscarriages before she was born. She called them ghost siblings that constantly haunted her. She had a history of self-harm, and honestly, maybe worst of all, she suffered from this crippling paranoia that she didn't even deserve her success, and that it was all going to be brutally snatched away from her at any moment. So the intense darkness of Detroit didn't just stress her out. It acted like a giant crowbar, prying all these deeply private traumas wide open.
Desperate for some kind of relief, she dives headfirst into wellness culture. She picks up a self-help book called The Inner Fix, which basically suggests replacing destructive addictions with spiritual ones. So she goes all in. She starts doing daily guided meditations, totally abstains from partying or drinking, and starts obsessively haunting the personal growth section of bookstores. Now, on the surface, this looks like a huge positive pivot, right? But as she points out, wellness culture rarely turns the mirror on itself. She wasn't actually healing. She was just transferring her addictive personality into this obsessive search for spiritual enlightenment. And without realizing it, she was setting herself up perfectly to fall for someone who claimed to have all the answers.
Section 5. Enter the energy healer.
So her personal trainer notices how heavy a toll the movie is taking and suggests she see an energy healer named Grace. And let's just pause right here and ask a really chilling question. How exactly do you manipulate a highly successful, highly intelligent, but intensely vulnerable person? Well, you definitely don't do it with force. You do it by quietly exploiting their sheer desperation for relief. Grace lived in this beautiful, swanky Boston apartment, played soothing background music, and even had this tiny, charming little pet tortoise waddling around. It all felt so incredibly safe and serene. But make no mistake, the psychological trap she was laying out was calculated down to the letter.
So the crucial point is how systematically Grace executed this whole manipulation. First off, Grace completely refused to explain her own methods, basically forcing Hannah to break the silence and speak first. And because Hannah was already used to traditional therapy, she just immediately bared her soul. She poured out every industry anxiety, her history of self-harm, the heavy secret of her survivor's guilt, the whole 9 yards. And Grace? She just sat there, nodding, playing the perfect sympathetic listener. But once she had all of Hannah's deepest, darkest wounds laid out on the table, Grace sprung the trap. She offered some basic treatments first, but then started upselling the, quote, good shit for people who really wanted to sort their lives out. She promised she could bring in the light and activate ancient spiritual DNA. And Hannah, totally desperate and already trained to be a vessel, just surrendered completely.
And what was the actual cost of surrendering her autonomy, her grip on reality, and ultimately her own mind to this predator? $150. Seriously. She paid this shockingly mundane price with a quick little swipe of a credit card on a tiny Wi-Fi machine. Just a completely normal, everyday transaction that literally bought her a one-way ticket straight into a psychiatric ward.
And the whole nightmare basically culminated in these 3 simple words from the man who was eventually pulling the strings in the dark. Magic is real. Those are the exact words that bound her to this highly dangerous world of make-believe, a world where she literally forgot her own name, where she couldn't tell the difference between up and down anymore. It is such a terrifying reminder of just how fragile our reality truly is when our psychological defenses are down, and it leaves us with one incredibly provocative thought to chew on today. If a smart, successful person could be meticulously dismantled and led right into this trap, how sure are you that, given the exact right vulnerabilities and the exact right manipulator, you wouldn't fall for it too?